A few months ago, it was looking like we'd never get an ending to this near 7-year-long series. Thankfully, Skybound came to the rescue and managed to secure the series, allowing it to be finished. A small team, Still Not Bitten, was created, composed of about 40 people who worked on the previous episodes, and they would be given resources to finish the game. There's a bit of controversy with the whole Epic Games exclusivity drama, which is a bit of a hot topic, but I can honestly say I really don't care, because if it wasn't for Epic, episodes 3 and 4 would never be brought to light, so I'm okay with it. I don't really agree with the exclusivity stuff, but I'm just thankful that the game is going to be finished in some form, and I'll take it. Anyway, I just want to talk a little bit about episode 2 before I begin talking about episode 3, but if you'd rather me just skip to the point about episode 3, skip here. So I was planning on making an episode 2 review for the series, and I actually did put some effort into doing so, but there was constant misinformation and news around that time, and it put my video into a bit of a weird position because it really did look like we would never be getting episode 3, so I decided to hold off, and by the time things cleared up, I felt like I waited too long to talk about it, so I just ended up not making it. I still have the completed script, so if you want my more detailed thoughts, there's a link in the description to it if you want to read basically what I would have said in that video. The condensed version is I did not like it. I felt like the directing was a big step down compared to the previous episode. It was really poorly paced. I mean, we go from being kicked out of the school, to meeting Lily and Abel again, to meeting James, to going back to the school, all in the course of like a day and a half. And then there's like a 2-week time skip in the middle where nothing happens. There were only 2 new locations, and it wasn't nearly as engaging as episode 1. I was also really not a fan of the way that they handled Lily as the villain, or her introduction. She felt more like a villain of the week than a real person. Overall, my opinion of the game wouldn't be very high if this was the last time we ever saw Clementine. Thankfully, however, it's not. And after a long wait, episode 3 is finally here. And I was hoping that this episode would be a lot more like episode 1 than episode 2. The fact is though, it was much better than either of those episodes, which was really unexpected. I was completely immersed in what was going on, and there's a ton of things I found it done really well. I should say though, I was totally willing, and still am for episode 4, to ignore the technical errors that might happen as a result of the shift of staff, but surprisingly, at least for me, this was actually the least problematic episode I've played. I was expecting quite a few glitchy or slow laggy scenes or weird animations, but in fact, a lot of the animation this episode was really polished. There's a great scene where Lily is describing what Minerva did to her twin sister Sophie, and you can see her face begin to twitch as she recoils at the memory of what she did. I also noticed that young Clementine was a lot more animated in her movements. There's a few more things I could point out, but the point is, I feel like this episode was extra polished, and it really did pay off. I'm not expecting this kind of thing for episode 4, although I appreciate the time and effort that they went into in making these scenes that much better. Broken Toys really managed to flow through a lot of tonally different scenes, and they all worked harmoniously. Nothing really felt out of place to me. Well, except for one scene I'll talk about later. The party scene was nice, and Violet has a surprisingly decent singing voice. I was worried it would be a bit too, Beth Greenish, if you know what I mean. But it wasn't bad actually. The whole scene has a nice, light-hearted and melancholy feel about it. The part where they start mentioning everyone who died and listing them off is actually pretty sad. Especially when you consider that if Clementine were to do the same, that'd be a pretty long list. I really liked the barn scene and the fact that it took place entirely in first person. It was a really good idea, and hearing the heavy breathing of Clementine as she's wading through these zombies to touch the wind chime was really unsettling. It was pretty great. I'm not really sure what I was supposed to get out of it though, as it mostly felt like Clementine was just doing it so she could convince James to help us. Speaking of James, he's a lot more fleshed out in this episode, and we learn about his history and why he holds the philosophy that he does. He's a character where there's a lot going on with him that isn't really present on the surface. The way he described seeing people in the walkers felt like guilt to me. Like, part of him doesn't want to believe that his actions completely removed the person that existed. His mindset has clouded his rationality. He's a deeply damaged person with no family or friends beside him. His story's a tragic one, and his values are what will ultimately get him killed in the end. That being said, I personally really enjoyed every scene with him. He's a person with flawed principles, and that's always an interesting dynamic to play with. It's a big reason why I liked Kenny as a character in the previous games as well. The other characters are all fine, but I feel like it should have been Ruby that got kidnapped instead of Omar, since he's had very little screen time, and Ruby was given her own scenes in the previous episode. Like, everyone has had their own moments to shine except him. It's kinda sad. I wasn't really the biggest fan of Lewis, as I mentioned in the first episode, but having saved Violet, I really felt bad for him here. I'm actually impressed that Skybound went as far as to remove his tongue and hinder his ability to speak. That's a pretty damn bold move. Typically, they would give the character some kind of conditional, like what they did with Abel last episode, where he just gets a limb removed, but there isn't really any tangible consequence and he just carries on like nothing changed. But here they went really hard on him, and they arguably removed what makes him himself. It's a genuinely bad outcome, and I regret not saving him, especially after seeing how Violet reacts if you did save him. As for AJ, I wasn't really feeling the relationship the past 2 episodes, but I feel like now I've started to develop a connection with him, to the point where I'm invested in what could happen to him. That said, I'm not entirely sure where they're going with it. I feel like we're more in control of the person he'll be than in the first episode, and I'm honestly not sure how well I'm raising him. I've tried to keep him generally pacifist, but there are just some situations that cannot be resolved peacefully, and it's pretty difficult for a 6-year-old to understand something nuanced like morality. What's good is that he isn't fighting against me like he was in the first episode. He's making a genuine effort to try and change for the better, and I like that. I just hope that both our words and actions have an impact on the type of person he is, and it isn't just our difficult choices that define him, as that would feel like a cop-out and everything Clementine has tried to explain to him would just fall on deaf ears. I don't know if I mentioned it before, but the voice cast for this series is top-notch. Abel's such a real piece of shit, but his voice actor did such a spectacular job during the interrogation scene that it actually made me feel bad for him. If there's one thing that the Walking Dead games have always had, it's fantastic voice casts, and the final season is no different. The first act of the episode was quite long, and I was surprised at how long it was until I saw the achievement pop up. Some people might have found it a bit slow, but I was honestly immersed from start until the end. The first episode was quite slow in the middle, and the second episode was rushed and still at the same time, but this episode I feel had a healthy balance of action and dialogue in just the right places. The last third of the episode was incredibly tense, and I'm usually against the more action heavy scenes in these games, but here I was hooked. The assault on the ship is such a well coordinated scene that was done entirely in one shot, and it's used to make you feel like you're right there in the thick of it with Clementine. The developers really pushed the Telltale tool to its limit to get this scene working, and I think the payoff was so worth it in the end. As great as an episode as this was, it was not without its problems. One of the biggest problems for me is the biggest source of conflict in the game. Lily. Besides the great voice acting by Nikki Rapp, her inclusion is just bad. Lily's a villain that really doesn't make a lot of sense. She's apparently the head recruiter for Delta, a community that we haven't seen at all, know nothing about, except that they enslave anyone who they can to fight for them, and that there's some community war raging out there, and they don't seem to be winning. The problem is that this sense of urgency is never conveyed in the writing. At no point does Lily appeal to Clementine from an emotional standpoint. She could have talked about their experience at the motel and compare that situation to now. They would have some common ground, and while Clementine would probably see through that manipulation, the fact that she doesn't even try and instead goes on generic monologues about what a bad person she is removes any kind of humanity that she would have had. The other problem is we still don't know anything about how she ended up in the position she's in. How did she end up at Delta? What's her relationship with the other characters? Why is Delta worth fighting for? None of these things are ever established, and there's no kind of understanding with her. Compared to previous antagonists, Lily is by far the weakest. Abel said that the other community made him look like a good guy. Why not use that? Explain that they're the lesser of two evils. But no. Instead, we can't sympathise with her, and she doesn't even try to justify herself or her goals. She'd just rather gloat and act like an asshole. My other problem is the whole community war in general. Assuming the bomb plan works and the ship sinks, we can only assume that Delta is going to lose the war since they have less supplies and people now. I've got a feeling we're never going to see the resolution of this war, and I'm not entirely happy with the uncertainty of whoever Delta was fighting, that they won't come and follow Clem. Another thing I didn't really like was the Lee scene. Listen, I love Lee. He's one of my favourite characters from a video game ever. But this Lee obsession that's been going on since episode 1 is really silly. The models look nice and it wasn't a bad scene by any means, but I have no idea why it exists. It's just meaningless fan service, and the more I keep hearing about him, the more it takes away from the glory of his final scene in the first season. Clementine has literally mentioned Lee more than her own dad at this point, and she was only with the man for about 4 months. Why is there no mention of her experiences with Krista, who she spent more than a year with, or determinately her time at Wellington, or with Kenny, who she spent 2 years with? Surely that time is far more significant. There hasn't been a single reference to either Kenny or Krista, despite them playing a pretty damn large role in Clementine's life. It's honestly pretty ridiculous. I don't think with everything that's going on next episode that they'll even acknowledge their existence, and it's an issue that's been plaguing the writing for this season since the start. Besides that, I really enjoyed Broken Toys, and it's probably the best Walking Dead episode since A House Divided, which was nearly 5 years ago now. My hope is that they can keep this momentum that they have here and carry it into episode 4, because if there's something that everyone is going to remember, it's how this series ends. I really hope they do it justice. I don't have any predictions for the finale. I really don't know where they're going with it. I just hope it impresses me as much as this episode did, and hopefully it leaves me with something that I'll remember for a long time, just like Season 1 and Season 2's endings did.